and a young woman came in and she had on just a skirt and blouse, and she was one of the sisters, and it was so different from what I remembered. And I realized that it was my perception because I was so young. And as you know, baby Katie, it wasn't just a few years ago. It was quite a few years ago because baby Katie's here with Mama Kathy and Daddy Mark. And she just graduated from LSU, as you know. So anyway, life went on. And one day when we moved to a different location, by the way, out in Lakeview. So at about the end of my junior year in high school, I came home one day, and I was expecting to ramble on to my mother about everything that was happening in school and how happy I was and so on and so forth. But when I went in, she was kind of wild-eyed. It was, so I knew something was wrong right away. She told me to pack everything I could carry, whatever I could carry, and that we were leaving my dad. So I was 16 years old, and I remember grabbing my radio. That was the most important thing in my life, I guess, at that time. And we left, and we moved in with my grandparents, and that was the last time I slept in that house, the house that I grew up in. It was a traumatic experience. But, you know, God is so gracious. God is so good to us. He had introduced me, well, not God had, but he had arranged to have me meet AP a few years before that, actually, when I was 14. And we started dating around that time, around my 16. So AP had called me, and I had to call him back to tell him to pick me up at my grandmother's house. So God had supplied my needs at that point, and it was a good thing. Well, my mother ended up having a nervous breakdown, and it was a hard year, and I found out a lot of things that had gone on with my dad that I didn't know anything about. So, of course, we continued praying for my dad. And I finished high school and started Newcomb, and AP was now a junior at Tulane, and when he graduated, when he was senior, he graduated, and I was going into my junior year, except that I didn't. I went with AP in the Navy. We got married, and we moved around. We moved up to Newport, Rhode Island, and moved quite a bit with the Navy, but we had 3 children in the process. And then AP retired from the Navy at the active reserves. He retired from the active duty to the reserves. And we bought an oil distribution business in Picayune, Mississippi. So that's where we ended up. Well, we loved Picayune when we got there. It was a friendly little town. It was much smaller than any place I had ever lived, but I found out in Picayune that the small town people create their social life. There was always something going on. There was a little country club and golf club, and so there were always parties going on there, and somebody was having a tea or maybe a sherry party or something. So there was always parties going on in Picayune, and we were happy to be there. Our children were growing up, and but there were very few Catholics in Picayune. And I remember very often I'd get a knock on the door, and somebody from a little Baptist church would come and invite me to come to their church. And, I mean, being neighborly, actually, but they'd ask me if I was saved. And that was always an uncomfortable thing because I didn't know whether I was saved or not. I didn't know what that meant. But the priest finally worked all that out with me and showed me. Well, our oldest son, Skipper, was in kindergarten when we moved there. And the kindergarten was right around the corner. It was Miss Jackie's kindergarten. And it was a lovely place. Everybody in town loved that, and they wanted to send their children there. Well, he could walk, actually, because it was literally around the corner. Well, one day he came home and stood at attention and recited the Psalm 100. And that's the one that says, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands." He recited the whole psalm. We couldn't believe it. He was 5 years old, and he recited it perfectly. And I thought, not that I knew it was perfect, because I didn't know anything about the Psalms, except what I heard at church. But we realized at that point that we better learn something about the Bible, because we weren't very acquainted with it, like a lot of the people in town were. Well, while we were in Picayune, our 4th child was born, Tricia. And the children growing, and everything was going along well until at one point, all 4 of the kids got the mumps. And so they were in various bedrooms and miserable, full of things. And the second son, David, started running very high fever. And I went in at one point to check on him, and he was kind of screaming. He said, "Mama, there's smoke all over the room. Where's it coming from? I don't understand." Well, it seems that he had gotten a secondary infection, and he had encephalitis. And that was kind of a frightening thing for us. And we were friends with the doctor, and he came over. In fact, he came over twice a day during that time, and he allowed David to stay at home since there were 3 other children there that we were nursing. And he, I remember, put a drip in his arm and said somebody had to stay there all the time to watch him, to make sure he was okay. And my mother came up. I called her, and she came right up, and she stayed with him, and she said the rosary over and over and over again. And I really feel that the Blessed Mother's intercession really pulled David out of all that, because he went through a hard time, but the Lord took care of him, and he's fine now. There's no problems. But I think that the Blessed Mother's intercession for him was very significant in his recovery. We were both devoted to the Blessed Mother. We were interceded. She interceded for us many times and got us through some real scrapes. I remember as a child worrying, if I prayed to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, would Our Lady of Prom Sucker be offended?